Arthur. I'm the King Arthur guy, and this is episode 7. This is going to be the first of 2 episodes on King Arthur, and this one is going to concentrate on the military situation, get into what little can be reconstructed of his life and reign in the next episode. So, to begin with, I'm actually going to start with 2 campaigns that did not directly involve Arthur. But they did take place in Arthur's time period. So the Irish still held 3 colonies by this point: Dyfed in southwestern Wales, the island of Anglesey off the north coast of Wales, and Dalriada in the Western Highlands. We will leave Dalriada out of it. That's not within the scope of this episode. So we'll start with Anglesey. It was liberated by Einion Gurt, who was the king of Gwynedd and the direct descendant of Cunetha, who had liberated Gwynedd, or the rest of Gwynedd, from the Irish. And we come to Dyfed. This is the more important one. It's accepted by virtually everyone else that Dyfed was not actually liberated from the Irish until the 10th century, whereas I'm convinced it happened in the Arthurian period, in the 490s. There are 2 genealogies for the royal house of Dyfed. Now, Gildas criticized the Vortapor, who was king of Dyfed in that time period. So, according to one of these genealogies, Dyfed was the son of, or rather, Vortapor was the son of Ercole, which is Old Welsh for Agricola, who was the son of Tryphon, which is actually not a name, it's the Old Welsh for tribune, who was the son of Clotin, which is a Roman name, which is Claudius. However, according to another one, Tryphon was the son of Aed, which is an Irish name. So if you look at the one that has the Roman names on it, from Clotin back, all the names are Latin, and the family was said to have been founded by Magnus Maximus. So the argument runs that since other dynasties claim descent from Maximus, that this is just propaganda. Maximus was a founding figure, so this was all made up, so it's the other genealogy that's the real one. I don't agree for a couple of reasons, but I'll just stick to one argument. As I argued in episode 2, Gildas was a Roman bigot, and he specifically referred to Vortapor as the bad son of a good king. The good king being Ercole, or Agricola. Well, then Agricola must have been Roman, because there's no way Gildas would have called an Irishman a good king. There's some other evidence as well, but we don't need to go into that. So this puts the liberation of Dyfed in the Arthurian period, and therefore can be attributed to Arthur's reign. Now, maybe Arthur was following the same kind of policy as Vortigern, of balancing out the factions and giving different factions territory in order to maintain the balance of power. But it's impossible to tell for certain. We're missing far too much information. But anyway, we'll move on to King Arthur himself. The British history records a list of 12 victories Arthur is said to have won. The ancient Britons made lists of victories of their great heroes. Several other battle lists survive. Now, Arthur's battle list has 12 battles on it, and he's also associated with 2 defeats, one of which I'll talk about here, the other, the Battle of the Field of Camlan, which is his last battle, I will talk about in the next episode. So, starting with the battle list, first battle was on the River Gleam in Lindisi. Lindisi is a variant form of Lindsey. Lindsey is the old name for northern Lincolnshire, and the Gleam is the glen. Archaeology proves that in the 490s, Anglo-Saxons did abandon territory along that river. So that's one of the very few battles we can not only identify where said to have taken place, but has independent evidence to support its existence. Then the 2nd through 5th battles were all along the banks of the River Douglas, which also in Lindisi. the Douglas would be the Witham. So why were there 4 battles along this river? Well, it's impossible to say. There's not enough information. Perhaps the Anglo-Saxons tried desperately to recross the river and take the territory that they lost. Perhaps Arthur fought his way across the river and then expanded his bridgehead by fighting along the banks, along the length of the river. There are several different possibilities, but in the absence of any more information, we can't really tell. But what is important is that there were a total of 5 battles, that's almost half the list, were fought in the same region, in Lincolnshire. And that region was quite marshy in those days. If we look at the overall strategic situation, the Anglo-Saxon southern flank was anchored on the Channel and could not be outflanked because the Britons were not very big on ships. The Anglo-Saxons held naval superiority. Their northern flank was then anchored on the marsh. So by driving them out of this marshland, Arthur outflanked them. That is, assuming that Arthur was following an overall grand strategy, which I assume he was doing, because I've already argued way back in episode 1 that he must have been a military genius in order to have brought about peace out of all the chaos that Britain was in at that time period. Okay, so let's move on to the 6th battle, which was on the river Bassus. We have no idea where that was. The 7th was the Caledonian Wood. This appears to have been a significant battle because it's referred to not only in the Latin but also in the Old Welsh, Cat Coit Caledon, cat being battle, coit wood or forest, and Caledon obviously Caledonia. Now, unfortunately, we only have a vague idea about this because the Caledonian Wood was a very large forest covering much of what is now central Scotland. We have no idea where in this forest Arthur would actually have fought the battle. And who was he fighting? Perhaps the Irish of Dalriada, perhaps the Picts, perhaps Gildas's own family, since they ruled Altclat, which later became known as Strathclyde. The Clyde being the River Clyde, and the town of Altclat is now Dumbarton, which is Scottish for Fort of the Britons. Or perhaps it was an alliance involving 2 or even all 3 of those groups. So we just have a vague idea as to where it was fought, and therefore can't tell for certain who he was fighting against. The 8th battle was Castle Gwinion. We have no idea what that was, although we are told that Arthur carried the image of the Virgin Mary on his shield, indicating that Arthur was a Christian. Most Britons in that time period were Christians, but not all. There was still a significant polytheistic minority. Number 9 is the City of the Legion. Well, I've already pointed out in a previous episode that the Britons referred to 3 places as City of the Legion: Arboricum, which is now York, Chester, and Caerleon. There are 2 slightly different versions of the battle list. This is not unusual. Medieval manuscripts were copied out by hand. Copyists sometimes made mistakes, they sometimes made deliberate changes. Discrepancies are referred to as scribal error. So one version of the battle list just says City of the Legion. The other says City of the Legion, that is Caerleon. I believe that this is the right one. This is more likely to be the older version. If the battle list was initially composed during Arthur's lifetime, when the nicknames for the other 2 were still in use, it would have been necessary to distinguish which one of the 3 cities was intended. However, a later copy made in a time period where the nicknames had fallen out of use, they would not have needed to specify there was Caerleon, because Caerleon would have been the only City of the Legion. So I think it's Caerleon. However, this doesn't tell us who he was fighting. Given its proximity, or its location rather, it could have been raiding Irish, or it could have been fellow Britons in a civil war. Okay, so this brings us to number 10, which is the River Trebuit, which I'm definitely not pronouncing correctly. We do have a pretty good idea as to where this was. In the Black Book of Carmarthen contains a battle poem in which Arthur is said to have fought a battle on a river with a very similar name, which I'm not even going to try and pronounce. And we're told that Bodweir commanded a legion at this battle. Bodweir appears in the Arthurian legends as Sir Bedivere. But anyway, we know that this river was the name that the Britons had for a river along the border between their territory and Pictish territory. So that means, hey, we can actually identify Arthur's opponent in this case, and it would have been the Picts. So number 11 is the Battle of Mount Burgoyne, or Mount Agnet, pardon me, also the Battle of Burgoyne. It depends upon which version of the battle list you're talking about. The list that simply says City of the Legion, without specifying Caerleon, says Burgoyne, whereas the other version says it was Mount Agnet. But Burgoyne is also on the battle list for Urin of Reget, so this looks like scribal error. So where was Mount Agnet? Well, according to the highly unreliable Geoffrey of Monmouth, so this has to be taken with a grain of salt, Mount Agnet was the name that the Britons had for one of the mountains overlooking Edinburgh, the mountain that is now called Arthur's Seat. Well, yes, there is a mountain called Arthur's Seat, and that name has to come from somewhere, but we're not sure where. It could be that this is Mount Agnet. However, we can't even prove for a fact that the Arthur referred to is actually the famous King Arthur, although chances are that it probably is. But anyway, who would he have been fighting? Well, possibly the local Britons themselves. In the kingdom of Managorethin, their family was of Roman descent. Maybe he was not fighting them, or maybe they were on his side and he was attacking Picts. Again, just knowing the location doesn't necessarily tell us the enemy. Now, before I get to the 12th battle, the Battle of Badon Hill, I want to bring in another battle, one of Arthur's defeats, the Battle of Thungborth, also known as the Battle of Portsmouth. First of all, I will point out why we believe that Thungborth and Portsmouth are the same battle. Thungborth comes from a battle poem called Geraint, son of Urban, and it's the eulogy for this hero Geraint, who was killed in the battle. The precise linguistics of the name Thungborth are disputed, but it appears to incorporate the word for a port. It may be derived from the Latin longa navis, which means a port for warships. Now, under the date 501 in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, there's an entry of the Battle of Portsmouth, in which the Anglo-Saxons defeated the Britons and killed a very noble man. So in both cases, we have a battle in the Arthurian period. It's fought at a port. The Britons lost, and a important Brythonic hero was killed. So chances are they're the same battle. However, many people would argue that the battle is in the wrong place, that it was not in fact during the Arthurian period, but was later, because the poem is called Geraint, son of Urban, and is clearly a reference to King Geraint II of Dumnonia, who died sometime around the year 450, whereas the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle places the battle in 501, and the Brythonic material puts Arthur as reigning in the 490s and for the early 500s. So the argument runs that the reference to Arthur was added to the poem later, because the poem was originally written in Brythonic, but at some later date it was revised and written in Old Welsh, the same way someone might take a Shakespeare play and render it into modern English. And the reference to Arthur is supposed to have been added later. It says, "At Thungborth I saw Arthur, the emperor, leader in toil, his men fought bravely in battle." I totally disagree with this interpretation for several reasons. First of all, although neither the Britons nor the Anglo-Saxons were any good about recording dates in this time period, so they sometimes got the dates wrong, I've never seen hard evidence that a date was wrong by more than like 20 or 25 years. In this case, it's supposed to be wrong by about 50 years. And not only the Britons are supposed to have got it wrong, but the Anglo-Saxons are also supposed to have got it wrong by that much. that's a little far-fetched for me. Furthermore, if Arthur was not actually at the battle, why did they say that he was, given that they lost the battle? Why would they have deliberately associated him with a battle they lost unless he was actually there? And I also think that the identification of the Geraint in the poem as being King Geraint II is wrong. It's not the reference to Arthur that was added later, it's the title. Most Brythonic poems from the 5th and first half of the 6th centuries don't have titles. Today they're referred to by a number and the title of the book in which they were written, such as Poem 21 in the Black Book of Carmarthen or something like that. So it looks like it was the title that was added centuries later. Anyway, the Battle of Portsmouth is credited to a man by the name of Port, at least in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The problem is Port is not a name. It clearly comes from the name of the town. So the name of the person who won the battle has been lost. Well, I think he was Ali of Sussex. You may remember in the last episode, I recounted how Ali arrived in Britain in 477, according to the Chronicle, and began carving out a kingdom for himself in Sussex. He just drops out of the accounts, the last entry being in 491, when he massacred the garrison at the fort at Anderida, which is modern Pevensey. But according to both Bede in his Ecclesiastical History of the English People and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Ali was the first High King of the Anglo-Saxons, but there's no indication as to how that happened. And many people say that, well, Sussex was too weak to dominate other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, so Ali was probably chosen in some way. Well, according to the information we have, Baden knocked out all of the Anglo-Saxons at once, or at least all of the Anglo-Saxons that were still fighting the Britons. That indicates an alliance. An alliance would have needed a commander-in-chief. The commander-in-chief would have to have given orders to other kings. Other kings would only have taken orders from a high king. So it's quite possible that Ali was chosen high king or commander-in-chief of the alliance because he was recognized as their best military commander. So the size of the kingdom and its ability to dominate other kingdoms would not have been a significant point. So what were they doing in Portsmouth in the first place? The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says that they attacked it by sea. Well, I think that this was an attempt to create a showdown with Arthur, because this is where Arthur is supposed to have been based, down in this area in the southwest. Okay, so they attacked Portsmouth by sea, drew Arthur into a battle, which they won, but did not achieve their actual goal. Arthur survived, and apparently most of his army survived intact as well. So they would have needed to lure Arthur into another battle, this one that they would hope would have been more decisive. This is where we come to Baden. You see, I think Portsmouth and Baden are connected. So according to the information we have, Baden was Little Salisbury Hill just outside Bath. We know that Baden was the name that Britons had for Bath. In fact, the very first time the Anglo-Saxons refer to it, they call it Baden. They only started calling Bath later. However, all sorts of people have argued, no, it wasn't Bath, and they moved the battle around to suit their own interpretations. Well, I am making an interpretation, but I'm not moving the battle. I think that the Anglo-Saxons marched to Baden, or to rather the Fort Little Salisbury Hill, in order to draw Arthur into another battle, because it was a strategic location. Control of Little Salisbury Hill would have given them control of much of the surrounding countryside. According to the Welsh annals, Baden lasted for 3 days. Now, the only account we actually have of the battle comes from the highly inaccurate Geoffrey of Monmouth, our 12th century storyteller who passed himself off as an historian. According to him, it was 2 days. But Geoffrey was only following Arthur. Furthermore, Gildas called it a siege, whereas all the other references to it call it a battle. I think it was called both because it was both. So my reconstruction is the Anglo-Saxons reached Bath on the first day and assaulted the hill, the fort, but failed to take it. That's a siege. The fort had a signal tower, because all forts in those days had signal towers. They sent a signal for help. After Arthur's defeat at Portsmouth, he'd fallen back and reorganized, probably gained some reinforcements. Then he would have responded to this signal and marched to Bath to relieve the fort. The Anglo-Saxons then redeployed, so the siege became a battle. Now, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, the Anglo-Saxons drew up in wedge formations, in the plural, and said that this was usual for them. Geoffrey didn't know much about war in the time period we're talking about, but this is an accurate description of a popular formation called the Boar's Head. Each Boar's Head consisted of a unit of 10 men, 2 in the front rank, 3 in the second rank, and 5 in the third rank. And these wedges were very versatile, and men were trained to cooperate with these units, coordinating their movements and operating together. And it was very popular among not only the Anglo-Saxons but Germanic peoples in general for hundreds of years, but it had fallen out of use by Geoffrey's day. So I think Geoffrey had access to accurate information, even if he didn't fully understand it, because that's the only way he could have known about the Boar's Head. Now, we're told that Arthur drew up his army into companies. The Brythonic military system was based on that of the Romans, but the Romans had a couple of different formations for their companies, so that doesn't really tell us what happened. Furthermore, we have no information on the course of the battle, at least on the first day, other than that the Anglo-Saxons got the worst of it. Oh yes, I should also have pointed out that Geoffrey said that the Anglo-Saxons outnumbered the Britons, and they deployed at the base of the hill, trusting to their numbers. Well, they may have been trusting to their numbers, but they may also have been trying to avoid being trapped between Arthur's field army and the garrison at the top of the hill. Anyway, having had the worst of it on the first day, the Anglo-Saxons are said to have deployed onto the side of the hill during the night, preparing for the second day. And then they stood shoulder to shoulder with their shields in front of them. That's a shield wall. According to Geoffrey's account, the Britons launched several attacks against the shield wall, but were beaten back every single time. Then finally, Arthur pulled all of his knights together, gave them a rousing speech, and because of the adrenaline rush from this speech, they charged and were able to break through the shield wall. Okay, that's not what would have happened. Assuming, assuming for the sake of argument that there actually was a shield wall, then really the only way to break it would have been using a feigned retreat. Okay, so the Britons had cavalry, that is horsemen. The Anglo-Saxons did not. So they would have sent a unit of cavalry to attack a particular line in the shield wall, and then pretended to have been defeated and to have been running away. Some of the Anglo-Saxon men, usually the younger, more hot-headed, less disciplined men, would have taken the bait and chased after them. Once they had been dislodged from the shield wall and they could be isolated, surrounded, and killed. Doing this 2 or 3 times would have weakened the shield wall. Once Arthur judged that the shield wall was weak enough, he would then have called all of his men together, his cavalry, which Geoffrey was referring to as the knights, and would then have charged at the point where Arthur considered it to have been the weakest in the wall. If this was successful and the shield wall was broken, then the Anglo-Saxons would have been sitting ducks, They would have had no real way of escaping. The Britons would have had the advantages. They were on horseback, they could go faster, they had the longer reach. The only thing that was protecting them, the Anglo-Saxons, was maintaining the shield wall. So if it was broken, then they would be killed, or defeated anyway. Now, according to the British history, Arthur himself killed 960 of the enemy. Now, that's obviously not true. In fact, it's quite possible that the entire Anglo-Saxon army did not consist of 960 men. It's impossible to tell how big or small these armies were. There's not enough information to work with. I mean, the longer the battle, the larger the armies involved. So the fact that this battle did last a couple of days indicates quite a large army by their standards. But what exactly did that mean? So we have no way of knowing. It's possible that 960 was the total number of Anglo-Saxons killed. On the other hand, some people would argue, no, they didn't even have that large an army altogether, and then 960 is just made up. There's all sorts of things that we just don't know. Well, anyway, Gildas said that Baden was decisive. It was not the last battle, but it was decisive, and it led to a period of peace. So I'm going to leave off there for this episode and go into what I can about what we know about Arthur and his reign in the next episode. If you've gotten this far, thank you for watching. I hope you'll subscribe, maybe leave a comment, a thumbs up, and I hope to see you next time. And until then, be seeing you.